Hello, everyone, and welcome back to an awesome episode of the BIF Bites Podcast. It's been a bit. We took a little break to do the July exam, but we are back and ready to go. I am joined, as always, by my three awesome co-hosts. We got Mr. Brennan Flaherty. How you doing?
I'm good, Jerry. How you doing?
Awesome. Mr. Mike Long. How are you doing, Mike?
Doing okay, gentlemen. Hope you're having a great summer.
Excellent. And Adam Shear, how are you, good sir?
Fantastic, Jerry.
Excellent.
Great to be here.
Awesome. It's been a bit. It's good to have everyone back in the studio to talk about some awesome topics. And we got the monkey on everyone's back all throughout your life. You'll be dealing with it. Today's topic is inflation. You guys pumped to have your dollars lose value slowly to the grind of time?
Couldn't sleep last night.
Yeah.
So excited. Before we got into our main topic, though, we did want to try and start up a new little segment here. We're going to start off with what are you reading? We just kind of want to go around the room and just kind of warm you guys up with sharing with our audience kind of what you guys are reading right now, whether it's finance related or non-finance related. Just what are you passing the time with? Adam, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So I was reading a lot of business tax stuff for my EA exam, but I'm proud to say that that's done with, and I passed my last one, so Congrats. I actually have time to read. Woohoo! Yeah. It's so relieving to read non-tax stuff for your personal pleasure. But the book that I've been reading post EA stuff is by Adam Grant, and it's called Give and Take, and it's about how helping others can help to drive your success. So it takes just little vignettes of people out there in life and business world, coaches, teachers, and how through giving and generosity, they're able to fuel their success. And it's kind of goes against the grain. You know, people had this notion that, if you're in business, some people, I suppose, take and it's all about the angles. And this really runs contrary to it. It's supported by research and really a great read. I've enjoyed it a whole lot. I've zipped right through it. I'm about 3/4 of the way done. Highly recommended. And he has another one that just came out. The name escapes me, but it seems really fascinating as well. He wrote originals, just some really interesting stuff.
Who's the author?
Adam Grant.
Adam Grant.
Nice.
Yeah.
Awesome. Sounds good.
Yeah.
What about you, Mike? What are you reading?
Gripping page turner called, I'm actually rereading it. This is my second time, if that tells you how excited I am. And it's called Social Security, The Inside Story by Andy Landis. And I consider it to be the best book that exists to understand Social Security. Although I think Andy is retired and I'm not sure it's ever going to be updated. Mine's a couple years old. But I'm rereading it, but then also through the sections, I'm going into the Social Security handbook and see how the same thing is described in there. And if there's anything more that maybe didn't make it into the book, that would be helpful to know. I really want to up our game in the Bryant program, in the retirement course for Social Security. I think this is something that advisors need to know a lot more about to adequately counsel clients. So I'm really going to make a big effort to have some great stuff in the course. We have decent stuff now. I'm just going to make it better.
Awesome. And what about you, Brendan? What are you reading?
So along the same lines as Adam, in the sense of giving and all that altruism, I am reading something called The Greatest Beer Run Ever. And it's written by a guy by the name of John Donahue. And it's about, John Donahue, it's a true story. So John Donahue is a merchant marine. and he had served some time in the actual Marines pre-Vietnam, and he had a bunch of buddies that were in Vietnam, and he was in a bar in New York City, and they all had a handful of beers and decided that someone should go out there and bring beers to their buddies that are fighting in Vietnam. And he grabbed a duffel bag, filled it with raised like $300 in the bar that night. He got his, he didn't have a passport. So he went to Vietnam in, I think it was 1966, without a passport. And he just had his merchant seaman identification, which apparently is like a passport. And 4 cases of beer, and he went all into North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and brought his buddies beers.
Huh.
Awesome.
Wow. Sounds good.
Beers and also good tidings from home was the it's so I'm about halfway through it. It's good. It's about to become a movie too, and ironically, it's my wife that bought it for me. But it is a good book.
Awesome.
Well, I'll say in my life, every beer run I've ever made was the greatest beer run ever.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, what's the greatest beer run is the next one, right? The next one.
I'll be right back, guys.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, I am also reading a fun one. I'm reading a collection of short stories by Frederick Brown. Frederick Brown he's pretty much kind of considered a grandfather of the sci-fi world. He was writing short stories in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And one of his most famous stories, and probably a bunch of you have probably heard of it without even realizing it, it's a 2-sentence story. And the entire story is just the last man on Earth was sitting alone in a room, and there was a knock at the door. And that's just the end of the story. So I've been really enjoying that. He really loves his twist endings. But the reason why I wanted to talk about it today is because he wrote these stories in the 40s and 50s. And it is hilarious to read about inflation in these, because he talks about, going to the diner and getting a cheeseburger and a milkshake for a nickel, or, filling his car up for a quarter. And it's just so funny to think about that. Not too long ago, the dollar went a whole lot further than it does now. And especially in the last year, we've seen some pretty crazy inflation across the board in a whole bunch of areas. And that, I think, I just wanted to segue into our main topic of the episode. Let's get into inflation, guys.
Yeah, well, we're certainly starting to see it. It's the big debate right now is whether or not the inflation that we're currently seeing is something that's transitory or is going to be short-term in nature or is more persistent. And I think there's a lot of debate right now as to what is actually going to happen. Certainly the Fed is hoping for and is currently along the lines that it will be transitory in nature and won't stick around for very long, and therefore doesn't require any kind of policy adjustment. But I think that there's definitely some better than average chance that we're going to see some inflation sticking around for quite some time.
Yeah, that's a great point, Brendan. I'm glad you brought that up first, because that's an important distinction to make between inflation and short-term price hikes. When toilet paper gets sold out at the supermarket and goes, up to $20 a roll, that isn't necessarily inflation if prices come back down. Yeah. If prices stay there for a projected period of time, then yes, that is insane inflation. But short-term price increases are not inflation, and that's a good distinction to make.
And certainly in an economy that's very well developed like ours, and others similar to ours, inflation is necessary, right? We need some form of inflation in the system for the system to remain healthy. And that target right now in our society, or our economy, I should say, is somewhere between 2 to up to 2.5%. Right now we're, based on the last print that I saw, we're trending about twice that amount. So we're above 5% year over year.
Yeah, that's another good point. Inflation usually has a very negative connotation, but that's not necessarily the case. Healthy inflation is good because inflation actually discourages hoarding. no inflation, or even worse, negative inflation, deflation is actually much worse for an economy, because think about it as a consumer. If you tell yourself, oh, I could buy this product today, or I could wait 6 months from now and buy it cheaper, you're going to say, oh, I'm just going to sit back and wait for prices to go down, and I'll buy it when it's cheaper. And when the entire country as a whole prescribes to that thought process, you have an economic collapse because no one buys anything. And it just ends up being a snowball effect where the economy spins out of control. No one spends any money. Money doesn't go into circulation, and the whole system just kind of falls apart. So deflation is actually for economists at least, is actually a much scarier thing than inflation.
Would there not be some segment of the population, though, in inflationary times that would hoard, that say, I'm going to buy this stuff now because I'm going to need to buy it again in however many months, weeks, years, and I don't want to pay more for it later.
So that's two different. So hoarding money versus hoarding products and assets. Hoarding money is bad because if you just sit on all your money in your bank account and don't spend it, that money doesn't get into the economy. It's called velocity of the dollar. When the velocity of the dollar is low, that's generally bad for the economy because money isn't being spent. It's not changing hands, and it leads to a slowdown in the economy. Hoarding products, while bad for people because, it's not being used, people can't use it. Hoarding products is actually technically good for the economy because it's more money being spent, more money changing hands. When you buy 300 rolls of toilet paper, Mike, have your entire garage stacked floor to ceiling with toilet paper.
I do.
You are paying that money, and now the toilet paper producer can now take that money and make more rolls of toilet paper, which creates jobs, and then they have to buy the raw materials from a different company, and now that company gets to create jobs. It's really a domino effect that by buying products, you are putting that money back into the system, which then gets turned over, over and over again from one hand to the other, which is, just how the economy is stimulated and marches forward.
And so what do you guys think might be some of the contributing factors? So I've heard a million different things about what people think is leading to this right now. And certainly some of that stems to why is it going to be transitory versus something that sticks around. So what are your thoughts? Why do we see this inflation all of a sudden?
So, we'll see where this goes, but we're sort of out of the woods pandemic-wise regionally, I guess you could say that. The Delta variant aside, and just some of the, everyone getting out there and being able to get back to normal. I think of my recent vacation up to Maine, and we were in Acadia National Park and talking to some of the locals, and they're like, everyone has vacation revenge this year. And like everyone is like out there spending money and I suppose that would suggest more of a temporary thing that's going to smooth over. What's on the other side of it? What signals that this is a more lasting thing, or what else is there? What is that everyone's reading and hearing?
I tend to agree with what you just said. That I think a lot of it can be price increases right now, where you've got more limited supply and more people now more freely spending, chasing those goods and services, which bids the price up. We also have post-pandemic, if we can call it that, because we may be going right back in. So many industries are really having a hard time staffing. Drive down any metropolitan street and you just see help wanted, help wanted, help wanted, help wanted. And so production, that impacts production. So that further diminishes supply, but yet people have money and are willing to spend it chasing those goods. So that could go on for a while, which then what do you call it?
I agree. It's one of those rare times that I think we're seeing both a supply shock where we're just having those shortages for a number of reasons. I mean, the entire supply chain has been disrupted by COVID, and I think it's that's likely to persist here for a little while, coupled with the fact that we've got all this pent-up demand. People have some money from the stimulus packages that have been put out, and they've been cooped up for 14 months, and they're ready to go. And so I think you've got those two things kind of exploiting the whole issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really that's a large part of what's driving it.
Yeah, I gotta say, I don't think COVID is necessarily causing the inflation per se, more that COVID was the catalyst that kicked this all off, because honestly, I really feel like it was just kind of a perfect storms type situation where we've had a lot of things just line up over the last really 10 years, and COVID was the catalyst that kind of put it all into motion. We haven't really seen much inflation over the past couple years beforehand, and it does kind of feel like we're playing a little catch up. Probably one of the biggest examples of that is gas prices. If people kind of remember to the pre-COVID days, gas prices were at all-time lows. Oil was at all-time lows, and oil is a key benchmark that is a driving force of inflation and is also really representative of inflation, because so much of our world is based on oil for, gas for transporting goods, but also just anything made out of plastic, takes oil to produce. So when oil prices are really low, that in turn causes transport costs to be low, which in turn causes product build costs to be low. And as a result, you don't really see much price increase. And now COVID happens, we see massive supply shortages. That's now the catalyst for us to basically pay catch up. And all this inflation we've kind of missed out on over the past couple of years comes roaring back in all at once. And that, I think, is what's really giving us a lot of the sticker shocks that we're seeing.
I think this topic, like just about everything in finance, we'll be a lot better at explaining it after the fact, perhaps in excruciating detail, than we were at projecting it or even explaining it while it's going on. That's just been my experience in my long life. But yeah, we're a lot better after the fact. Then we understand everything, right?
Right.
Yeah, when you're immersed in it, I do think it's hard to see clearly as to what is actually happening in real time. I also think that, the historic policy adjustments that have taken place have got to be contributing to it in some form or fashion. We've got more money sloshing around the system than probably we ever have before. I'm sure ironically adjusted for inflation, maybe World War II was slightly larger, but we've got just historic monetary policy and fiscal policy tools at play. And so there's just a lot of grease to get put onto the fire here.
And also, we had our stimulus payments that came through, right? But with the advanced child tax credit, people are now, if you have kids and you fall within those phase outs, and they go pretty high, you're getting another nice little contribution for the next 6 months into your bank account.
Yeah. We also have to keep in mind that the government also pumped billions of dollars into businesses. There's been lots of programs for businesses that, while the stimulus checks definitely contributed to it, I just see a lot of news organizations and different groups putting this entire, everything squarely on the blame of the stimulus checks because it's the easy target. And while, yes, that definitely contributed, this is not, if we didn't do stimulus checks, it's not like we wouldn't be seeing inflation right now either. We would still be seeing massive inflation.
It's all fiscal policy that's happening. Both the government, the government injection into businesses and these stimulus checks are all part of fiscal policy.
Yeah, no, that wasn't anything against you, Adam. It's just I noticed that we had.
No, I wasn't taking it that way.
Yeah, but yeah, so it's important for everyone to remember. This is complicated stuff. There's not. If anyone tells you there's a simple solution to this stuff, it's there's going to be a lot more going on to it. I think there's also a fair amount of price memory in effect as well, because we talked about kind of the difference between price gouging and inflation, but price gouging can actually also contribute to inflation because of a term called price memory. And that's basically what the average person feels something is worth. So if you buy a gallon of milk for $1, buy a gallon of milk for $1 forever. And then it goes to, $1.50. You're like, oh, that's a pretty big price increase. Inflation's, killing me. I can't keep up with inflation. But if you have milk for $1, and now all of a sudden milk goes to $4, and you're like, oh, this is crazy. Price gouging is insane. And then the price comes back down and it goes down to maybe $1.50. Now everyone feels relieved because milk is cheaper, even though they're still paying 50% more than they were beforehand. And as a result, price gouging it leads to inflation, not because the prices go up so much to the price gouge amount, but just because it causes people to then accept a higher price later on because it feels like it's on sale compared to the price gouge price.
I've experienced that in my life. You guys probably have too.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So, Mike, what do you remember as the biggest point of inflation in your life, where you really noticed the higher prices impacting your, I guess, economic freedom?
Well, this would be as a college senior, and it was gasoline. Was, and there was an oil embargo going on, and I remember in my own life gas at $33.9, because I always said that's so stupid that it's 33 9/10, and I asked my parents, what the heck, why is it 0.9? But in my last year of college, gas prices just went nuts. And I remember I was heading home one weekend, and I didn't have any money, but I needed to fuel my car. And so I'm driving, heading out, and I see a gas station that shows on the billboard $57.9, and prices were probably $1.50 is where it was at. And I thought, oh, finally, there's a place that's not taking advantage. And I pull in there and actually take the pump out of the holster. It was closed. The gas station was closed. I didn't even catch that. I was so fixed on the $57.9, thinking, the guy across the street said $1.50. I'm not paying that. And then I remember, much later in life, hoping we ever see $3 again, because it had gone so much higher, and I was okay with $3. And then most recently, like you said, with gas prices being very low, relatively speaking, over the last couple of years, it's like, wow, maybe we'll stay here. Well, not so fast. But yeah, I felt that because I probably had barely enough to fill the tank that day.
Yeah, and back then, the car probably got, 5 or 7 miles per gallon?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. And we, the other piece of fiscal policy that kind of is at play with gas prices is obviously taxes. There's a lot of taxes in gas, so there's a lot of differentiation from state to state. So not all of it is just inflation. Some of it is also tax inflation. Now, Mike, when you were so this was probably late 70s, correct?
Yeah, and then I experienced professionally some effects of inflation and high interest rates. When I first started my career, money market rates were double digit.
Yeah.
You could get 14% or more.
Yeah.
And people never talked about, but inflation is 16.
Muni bonds paying like 23%.
Yeah. That was at the beginning of my career. And what I witnessed with it, starting out in the life insurance business, were universal life projections, illustrations. And then nobody had really PCs doing them in their office. You sent in to the home office for them and they sent them back. But those things being projected at huge numbers. And then only to have those universal life policies blow up later. And folks were required to put in some pretty substantial premium increases because that 12% that was projected didn't last very long, and they were minimally funding contracts. So it's like, and that led to some pretty serious regulation on what and how illustrations can be built. But, that was part of that same period of time from graduating and then starting right into the industry, literally the day after. But I saw it in play at work as well.
Yeah.
And then, of course, buying a house, right? You're right now, I think for really the last 20 years, by and large, mortgage rates have been pretty reasonable historically. And I think that, back in the early 80s, people were paying 17% for their 30-year fixed mortgage.
I paid on my first house, what year was that? 82, 12%.
Yeah.
That I thought was a real deal. I bought a different house last year and it was 2.7.
Can I just say, speaking of inflation, I've been looking for buying a house for the past year, and finally I just gave up and I decided to sign another year on my lease because it's just not happening with this inflation market. It's just not happening.
Yeah, this has been one of the pieces that I've been most surprised by. The just huge level of activity that's going on in the residential real estate market. And I think that there's a number of factors at play. You started seeing it, I think, initially with vacation homes because people were trapped. They couldn't do anything. They couldn't fly anywhere. So all the money, the discretionary funds that they were using for these big trips, they said, well, we're not as comfortable doing that. Let's see if we can buy a vacation home. And those prices started in those areas started taking off. But then everything else just came with it. And I'm hearing stories from people who are overbidding by 20%, and they're not even close to being in the running for the house. It's crazy.
Cash only too. Yeah. They're saying
cash only, no contingencies.
Cash offers.
Yeah.
You know who's buying those houses? Pension funds. That's what's happening in housing.
Yep.
They're getting into the landlord business to
Boston
get
area,
high fixed income, and they're the ones bidding cash on a lot of these things.
Yeah.
So on individual houses, Mike, single family homes?
They're moving into suburbia and buying up and making rental properties. I don't know. Adam's the most recent to go through all of this.
That's right.
I think you had some wild experience too, didn't you?
Oh, yeah. We put our home on the market on a Friday. Saturday had an open house. We had 9 offers on Sunday. The highest and the one we took was full cash.
Yep.
And it was that quick.
Like in a suitcase?
Done.
Yeah, trunk.
I wish I would have seen that. It went through legal channels.
Yeah.
One of the things that I learned at our closing, just talking to the attorney and hearing what they were seeing on their end. I mean, they said it's been crazy, obviously for them, but they said just with remote work for this past year, a lot of people are coming from the city, and there's a trend that they were seeing here of not only buying a suburban home, but pairing it with a vacation home on the shore in Connecticut. They're like, it's this dual transaction where they're cashing out on their city home and they're just coming to a more suburban life. And
I think it goes back to something that I think Jerry was making a point of. If you're coming out of Manhattan and you're used to paying $2 million for a shoebox to spend $1.5 million on a much bigger home, it feels like you're getting a great deal.
I'm thinking about moving to like Dakota or something because
seriously,
in Boston, a 2-bedroom home on average, because I'm looking at these houses, reading all like the Zillow reports and all that. In Boston, the average 2-bedroom home is going for $100,000 above asking. $100,000 will buy you a home in like North Dakota, and that's the premium we're paying out here.
Yeah.
So.
Wow.
I live very close to Chicago, and I'm seeing what Brendan just described in my own neighborhood. 3 new neighbors that did exactly that. They cashed out in Chicago. We're only 30 miles from Chicago where I live, but it's pretty rural Indiana yet, and they paid cash here, and. Two of the 3 also bought another property, as Adam was describing, but it was all from the cash from the Chicago sale.
Yeah. It's like
what's amazing to me is who's buying in Chicago? It just seems because I think there's just been this. Well, why would I work? Why would I live in the city if I don't have to work here? Why would I want to deal with? I think there's definitely some people that just they want to live in a big city, and I think there's a time and place in everyone's life where that's a thing. And then some people they feel more comfortable there, and there's more to do. But most of the people that I talk to said, "Well, I don't want to deal with the traffic. I don't want to deal with the prices. I don't want to deal with the chaos. If I don't have to work here, why would I stay here?" And so it's amazing to me that they're finding so many people to come back and buy those expensive homes.
It's also the Airbnb craze. Tons and tons of real estate investors are buying up homes specifically, and especially in cities and high tourist areas, specifically to rent those homes out as weekend homes to vacationers who don't want to stay in a hotel, who want to stay in a house, but they want to stay in a house, across the street from Central Park.
I see.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I've been enjoying going on Zillow every day just to see what the new valuation of my home is. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're not going to like it when your tax bill comes due, though.
Yeah, that's true. But I'm seeing, of course, when I'm in there, I click around. I'm sorry.
50 years from now, when they hang the plaque up that says Mike Long slept here, what will it do to their value?
Exactly. That's exactly it. But I'm seeing, the reason I mention this is because then inevitably you click around in there in Zillow, and I'm seeing ads in Zillow, specifically what Jerry just described. This is a great Airbnb property. Hey, you investors. Yep. I mean, and it's not just one or two. It's many. That's how it's being advertised.
Yeah, it's an entire market segment now. So we've been kind of griping about the personal problems with inflation and just making everything more expensive. Let's kind of take a 50,000-foot view now and talk about, from a historical perspective, historically, what are the dangers of inflation and what can it lead to for just the economy as a whole and the country as a whole?
While we feel like we're in a period of pretty impressive inflation right now, by historical standards, we're not that bad, right? I think people start to extrapolate out, where this could go. But even still, when you look at the history of inflation in the U.S., we typically have periods of very high inflation coming out of wartime. So we had very high inflation in the late teens and early 20s of last century. We also had some pretty significant inflation coming out of World War II. Mm-hmm. But even that was mid teens. You look at places like Zimbabwe, where the inflation is in the hundreds of thousands of percent. That's obviously that's a whole different level and something that's probably not possible for an economy like ours. And so I think when we start talking about worst case scenario, I think we're looking at probably, again, that low double digit to very low teens inflation for some short period of time, but probably more. The real thing I think that the Fed and economists are starting to worry about is whether or not our GDP growth is going to be persistent, because I think they've conceded that inflation is going to be somewhat persistent, and so if we have a growth that doesn't keep up, we get into a worst case scenario where we have stagflation, which is a point of rising prices but not rising economic activity, right? And that's not good. Mm-hmm. And so that's where I think my main concern lies for this economy.
Yeah, and that's what we had in the late 70s, early 80s, like Mike was talking about earlier. That I agree. I don't think we're going to have like a Zimbabwe situation, or probably worst case scenario is like Germany in the 1930s, where economic collapse, inflation, and you just end up with this, pretty terrible situation. But yeah, I do agree with you, Brennan. I think we are much more likely to have kind of a more, late 70s, early 80s style, just kind of stagflation where, it kind of stinks, but it's not like the country's going to collapse because of it.
Well,
there's plenty of other things that might cause that.
Yeah, there's other things that could cause that. So,
and some out there would look at 5% year over year. I think that was June's number. Yeah. What's the big deal? What's all the fuss right now? That's not historically 5% isn't huge.
And Powell kind of said as much. I want to say again, it's hard that the last year seems so long, so it's hard to tell whether this is pre-COVID or within COVID. But he came out and made a statement that said, hey, listen, inflation kind of ran under our target for the last 10 years. It's under the 2% target. So maybe we can let it run slightly above that target for the next 10 years and average it over a 20-year period, and that's going to be okay. And I remember when he said it, I was like, God, that's kind of a weird thing to say. But that may be, in fact, might exactly that. Like maybe, hey, no big deal. It's not going to stay at 5. So what if it stays at 3? It's a little uncomfortable for a little while, but ultimately it's good for the overall average.
Yep. And I kind of hate talking about this because it feels kind of cheap and rubbing people's face in it. But the one silver lining of inflation is inflation does tend to also lead to higher wages because people need to be compensated to buy the things that they need to live. And like you said earlier, Mike, you're driving down Main Street and you're seeing help wanted sign after help wanted sign. Eventually businesses are going to have to realize that, all right, we need to raise wages. Otherwise people aren't going to be able to afford to work here because they're not making enough to buy what they need to live. So it's going to be a painful transition, but that is kind of a silver lining that, it goes hand in hand.
Yeah. And people, if fixed interest rates go up, then people that are seeking that investment of a fixed instrument, they're going to like that higher interest that they're being paid.
Yeah, it's true. Bond investors haven't had, people have been accepting like 2-3% on their bonds for, more than a decade now. Now you can, they can actually maybe have some bond investments that, won't get laughed out of the room. You can actually have a fixed income portfolio and count on it.
So like most things, half will be pissed and half will be joyful.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Right. And that's, unfortunately, we live in this society, this system of binary outcomes, right? It's this or that. There's no third option. And I think that's been another interesting, thing with all of this is the benefits. And this is a very political hot button. So step back from the politics, just look at it from an economic standpoint. The government has stepped in as a competitor in the labor market and has been the highest wage. And so that's kind of fed into some of these supply chain issues that we're seeing is that people, I think that all kinds of comes to an end here pretty soon without an extension of the benefits. But ultimately, it's been an interesting thing to see where people in the labor market aren't stupid. If they see that they can earn a healthier living wage with less effort, then that, why you'd be stupid not to take that. And so I think that it's going to be interesting to see what happens, what kind of slack occurs if and when those benefits get reduced, and whether or not it's going to force wages higher permanently, and what the reaction of other employers or other competitors in the labor market do as a result of that.
So to kind of wrap up the inflation talk, how do we help our clients when dealing with inflation? How do we explain it to them? How do we help calm them about their worries about it? And, how do we help them set themselves up to be in the best position to deal with a high inflation scenario?
Seinfeld episodes, the Kruger Industrial Smoothing. Mr. Kruger's answer to everything was, I'm not too worried about it.
Yeah. It's a good point. I mean, everything always reverts back to the mean, right? Over time and very well established. And, the benefit that we have in this economy is just how vastly developed it is and also how much statistics we have on it. I mean, we've got a lot of history here. And so you can look back in points in time where we have this inflationary pressure and look to what happens around it. And know that it too will come to an end. You don't know when, but it will. And so, you continue to counsel people to stick to their plan. Mm-hmm. Build that emergency fund. Use some of that stimulus money if you get it to build the emergency fund. Make yourself stronger for future unpredictable events.
True. Also, I think a big thing is now's a really good time to tell your clients not to have, massive stores of cash, because in a high inflation environment, the worst place to keep your money is under the mattress, because it's just going to be losing money, year over year, getting eaten away at by inflation. Have it be in, a bond fund or, CDs, even just anything you can other than cash, because people think cash is staying level. You're not making anything, but you're not losing anything. And in reality, you are losing a lot to inflation. And the higher inflation is, the more you lose.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's interesting is while, the bond market's not buying permanent inflation. The bond market yesterday closed pretty low. The 10-year Treasury yesterday, it was at 1.15%. That to me is a telling sign that the bond market, which I've said 100 times is smarter than the stock market. It just does not see this as, now obviously that could change, and we've seen a lot of volatility in that 10-year Treasury over the last 12 months. But seeing the data as it's been printed, the bond market's continuing to move towards lower rates over time.
I think so much what you just said. A lot of this comes down to the age-old, well, it depends. And so with clients, has the goal changed? Has the purpose of the investment changed? Has the period, has the likely term changed? And if not, staying the course could be a very great recommendation, but it depends. It depends. They used to drive me crazy as a young starting out, because everything was, well, it depends. Why? On what? What does it depend on? But now I realize that, it depends. And everybody is a little different.
And that's why the monitor piece is so important of the financial planning process, right?
Yeah,
monitor.
That's a great point.
This is where we said we were going to be. Here's where we actually are. Do we need to change anything? Right? And that's why, kind of sticking to that plan, taking the emotions out of it. Because I think it's really easy to look at what you're seeing on a daily basis and go crazy. Either thinking that things you could go find. This is part of the problem with the internet. I think that the Dow Jones is going to go to 200,000, and I can go find data to support that.
Yeah.
Or I think it's going to 2,000. I could find data to support that, and so I think you could make yourself sick with whatever theory you want to chase. And ultimately, if you just stick towards your plan and stop paying such close attention to the granular stuff that doesn't matter over time, as long as you're monitoring your plan.
Well, and the clickbait, because you're right.
Yeah.
There's this endless supply of any position, support for any position you want to take. And the headlines are so sensational, they're getting you to click into it. But it's all over the place. And that's why they need good financial planners.
Yes.
To help them, weather whatever the heck the storm might be.
It's true. I think in these epic bull runs over the past decade, it's easy for people to say, I'm going to do it myself. I can invest. I don't need guidance on that, because you could just throw money into the market and things are going to be all right. But I think these are those moments where having a really great planner in place can really benefit the client. And I'd say it is the plan. The plan is your foundation, but it's also the person. And I could see, if you have a client that is aligned with you and aligned with the vision of the plan, that you can adapt and you can be nimble and you can make those adjustments. I think with some clients too, they're going to see the clickbait. They're going to be having MSNBC or whatever is on in the background, having their head spin, and might be asking for some actions that aren't really in their best interest. But there again, I think is having a seasoned financial planner in place. That's what you're paying for. You're paying for great advice, good counsel, and just knowledge of how all this works and how it could benefit the client in reaching those goals.
We have kind of a different take on the question of the episode today, guys, just because inflation questions tend to be very complicated and very math heavy. Instead of just throwing a bunch of numbers and words at you guys and hoping you follow along, we're going to do a more relaxed approach to the question of the episode today and just kind of talk about how to generally solve for inflation and real rate of return when you are in a test-taking scenario. I guess, first of all, how would you go about identifying that you have an inflation-based question on the exam? What do you look for?
I look for CPI.
CPI.
I look for education rate of adjustment, inflation rate, right? Those are some of my cues. And
in today's dollars.
Right. In today's dollars. Yeah,
that's the big one.
That's it.
In today's dollars.
In exam land, in today's dollars. But those inflation rates are tricky in exam land too, because a lot of times there's a CPI rate, and then a little later they talk about the college inflation rate, or the expected compensation increase rate.
And what's the difference between those, Mike? Well, why does that matter?
Well, because typically, and I'll speak to education, that rate tends to be significantly higher, that inflation rate, than the CPI.
Yeah. And so what's the danger in using the CPI versus the education inflation rate?
You're going to be way underfunded.
Right. Who cares how much milk is increasing by if you're saving for college? You got to get your $5.29 up to par. You're not going to be buying a bunch of milk cartons 18 years from now when the kid goes to school. So those are the big ones. Sometimes they're just nice and they come out and say it. Inflation is X, Y, and Z, and that's nice. Other times it's hidden, real rate of return. Today's dollars, those are big red flags to watch out for. And then, like Mike said, make sure you're using the right inflation. Don't use the red herring inflation they toss in there.
And master, most education programs for CFP and even review programs reference that 3-step approach. And if one would have to do all 3 on the exam, I think it's more likely these days that it will test 1 or 2 of the steps in one question. But if it went all the way out to what do they need to save on a monthly or annual basis, understand that we deal with inflation in the first 2 steps. The first one is taking today's tuition, inflating it by the assumed college inflation rate, and come up with what that's going to be 18 years from now, or whatever that period is. And then we deal with it in the second step as well, because now we're looking at a present value calculation that determines how much do we need to have on hand on day 1 of college to fund those 4 or 5, or in some people's families, 8 years. And that college is going to continue to inflate every year, but the remainder of the monies are going to earn the assumed rate of return. And that's why we use an inflation-adjusted rate in step 2. In step 3, in calculating how much needs to be saved on an annual basis, we're just looking at the assumed investment return. Unless someone wants to do a serial payment, but that's a different discussion. But we've already dealt with inflation, and now we're just looking at what do we think the funds can earn to get us to that targeted amount on day 1. And if you master that process first and understand where you use the inflation adjusted rate, you're well on your way to getting those questions right.
Yeah. Yep. Now, that's a good point to bring up, Mike, because I work with students a lot on that. It's something they really struggle with, is that real rate of return, taking into account both inflation and your assets earning a return at the same time. And for those who don't know, the way you take that is you divide it. You divide the return by the inflation amount in order to get the real rate of return. And for them, their big question is, why do we divide it and not just do a simple subtraction? Shouldn't we just do, the rate of return minus the inflation? Why are we dividing it instead?
It's more exact, right? So the rate of inflation, or the inflation adjusted rate of return, is 1 plus the rate of return divided by 1 plus the rate of inflation, and then take that and subtract 1 from it. And you're going to find, so I'll just do the math quickly here. If we have an 8% return, we have 3% inflation, we'd have about 4.85% inflation adjusted rate of return. If we were to just subtract the 2, we'd say, well, the 8% minus the 3% rate of inflation would be a 5% rate of return. And so fine, it's close enough, right? But if you take that 0.15% difference and stretch it out over 30 years and apply dollars to it, it's gonna create a vastly different sum of money. And so when you're dealing with things that you stretch out over long periods of time, especially with compounding interest, you want to be as exact as possible, because it's gonna help you get better results.
Yep.
I learned the formula that Brendan just described, and I continue to use it today. And that's something to settle on early in your studies too, because there's also a nifty shortcut you can use for that, where your numerator is just the nominal rate minus the nominal inflation rate. So in Brendan's example, 8% return, 3% inflation, 8 minus 3 is the numerator, and you divide that by 1 plus the inflation rate expressed as a decimal. So the denominator would be 1.03, and you get the same 4.85 as you would with the longer formula. And my point is just settle on one of them and use it. I use the longer
Absolutely.
one.
That's new to me. I hadn't used that one before, Mike. There's also calculator shortcuts. I mean, if you want to go to that tier as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, like the guys are saying, pick your path, stick to it, and then know where that falls within these calculations. You'll be in good shape.
And don't take any of this lightly, particularly if you're a retake. Not that anybody ever talks about what they saw in the exam, but in the wind, I've just heard that there were some students that feel that calculations cost them in the exam because they didn't take the calculations seriously enough in their prep. They kind of thought, I'm cool on that. I can save time. And if one would run into a calculation-heavy exam, that could be lethal to the passing score. Yeah.
Definitely.
And it's important from a practice standpoint too. So once you get past the test and you're actually using the stuff, I mean, one of the most consequential things that you do in practice is plan for retirement, plan for education. And mistakes early create mistakes later, right? And so you want to be exact in your work, and you want to make sure that you're not going to leave your client short, for either one of them.
Awesome. Any closing thoughts, guys, before we wrap it up today?
I'm not too worried about it.
Excellent. I think that's going to be the title of the episode, Mike. I'm not too worried about it.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. We will see you all again next month, but if you can't get enough of some BIF Bites action, make sure you check out our website, bifbites.com. We got a whole bunch of stuff on there with back episodes, videos, articles, past questions of the episode that you can work on, so be sure to check that out. Until then, we'll see you all next month.
Take care,
Thanks,
everybody.
Jerry.
Bye-bye.